Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second Analysis and Activism talk. Tonight, we will look at the theme that was the most debated topic last spring. We have the pleasure to have Lara Sheehi, Stephen Sheehi. I hope the pronunciation is good enough. They will talk to us about psychoanalysis under occupation. I really want to welcome everyone tonight. There are many people around the world. I want to welcome especially, hopefully, friends, colleagues from Palestine, from Israel, and from Europe, North, South America, Africa, and Asia and Oceania. Allow me a disclaimer, which is a very important one. We want, with this analysis and activism talk, allow in-depth thinking and discussion. We want to allow polyphony of thoughts, as well as plurality of thoughts. Analysis and activism is a forum of almost 400 people. Analysis and activism does not have an official voice or view. Therefore, this should remain. Everyone is responsible for what he is sharing. Everyone is responsible for his or her own opinion and comment. I would like now to welcome our friend and colleague, Heba, that will introduce Lara and Stephen.
Thank you, Stefano. Good afternoon or good evening, everyone, from whichever part of the world you are or which time zone you are listening. It's lovely to see you all and to see your faces. Thank you, Stefano, and our steering committee for setting up this meeting. And thank you to everyone for being with us for this very special encounter and conversation with Dr. Lara and Professor Stephen Sheehi, though to us he's known as Isfan. We are quite a large group linking parts of the world whereby we acknowledge our locus and what we bring with us to this meeting. We gather here to warmly welcome tonight Lara and Stephen to our circle of analysis and activism. Lara and Stephen are Arab, Lebanese, American, and harbor a powerful connection to Palestine and to the Palestinian struggle. They will be talking to us tonight about psychoanalysis under occupation by developing two central themes, with Stephen uncovering the ideology underpinning the theory and praxis of psychoanalysis, whilst Lara addresses the insidious innocence of psychoanalysis. For the sake of maximizing our time with our speakers, I will paste in the chat box their complete and impressive biographies, but very briefly and in very few words, Lara is a psychologist, a psychoanalytic practitioner, a scholar, and an activist. Stephen is the Sultan Qaboos Professor of Middle East Studies. He is the founding director of Decolonizing Humanities Project and a scholar of modern Arab culture. Welcome both. Ahlan wa sahlan.
Hello, Pete.
Before we dive in, I would like to say a few words about their work and about their book published by Routledge, entitled Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine. It is a labor of love and a brilliant work on decolonial theory and practice that centers on the practice of Palestinian clinicians and their patients in seeking to restore and sustain a sense of self, community, and cultural integrity under the violence of settler colonialism. They unpick that the paradigm of trauma and resilience fades away when facing a subjectivity open to desire, emancipation, and the will to live. The book unravels how psychoanalysis is misused, consciously or unconsciously, and bent on normalizing a violent status quo. Yet Palestinians resist occupation in body and mind, revealing what is possible when psychoanalysis aims at liberation. The book lays out and highlights what Palestinian psychoanalysis per se entails. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Stephen and Lara.
Thank you so much يا هبة. يا أهلا وسهلا بالكل خصوصي بحبايبنا بفلسطين المحتلة. نحن كتير مبسوطين أنتم معنا. Hi everybody, my name is Lara Sheehi. Welcome and thank you so much. We always start with a land acknowledgement, but it seems especially important when we're talking about the issue of Palestine and when we conjure up the ongoing violence of settler colonialism. So in that vein, we'd like to acknowledge that we are on occupied Massachusetts land, and a shout out to all Indigenous people all over the world fighting those struggles. Thank you, of course, to Analysis and Activism, Stefano, Tine, and Hiba, who is not only wonderful colleague and comrade, but has been fighting the hard fight for quite some time. So we see you and we're so grateful to you for having us here today. So I'm gonna pass it off to Stephen, and he's gonna kick us off and then I will follow up. Let me just pull up your things.
So I apologize that I'm going to be doing what is now traditional, reading off the screen, which actually it's something I hate, but it's unfortunately the limitations of the medium. I don't feel I'm a particularly good reader, so do forgive me. And Heba, I just have to say this is the first time I heard someone introduce our book, and I asked her if you had read it, because wow, beautiful. It's like, woo! So thank you so much for that. And before I start, I just also want to recognize the importance to acknowledge all the political prisoners in the US Gulag. They're forgotten quite often or too often, so I just want to shine light on their struggle, in particular Leonard Peltier and Mumia Abu Jamal, but all free them all. Yours is different than mine.
Yeah.
The place where our clinical supervision by Israeli supervisors takes place is an old Arab house in which little, if anything, has changed since 1967. From the first time I stepped in this house in Talabiyya, a Jerusalem neighborhood, I felt a lump sitting in stolen Arab house with colonizers, talking about a profession supposedly based on humanism and in support of humanity and the humane. This is Ali. Ali's story of supervision, one of many, clearly depicts the spatiality and structures and processes of settler colonialism writ large, but also more specifically, the position of the captive Palestinian citizen who seeks training in clinical and community psychology in the settler colonial state. Innumerable stories have been entrusted to me and Lara, and we thank some of those who are here for entrusting them to us. And these stories repeat how therapy and supervision often take place within stolen homes of Palestinians expelled by the Israeli state or Zionist militias. Ali, as now soon to be licensed clinical psychologist, draws our attention to the condition of what Nadim Rohana calls a captive settler colonial citizen. Ali, as a captive settler colonial citizen in supervision, is surrounded by the traces of the undeniable material evidence of Palestinian presence. This presence stands in the face of a common disavowal by the powers under which he finds himself, whether they are the apartheid state or Israeli clinical supervision, and we will see that those are intertwined. Ali names the contradiction within the universal humanism of psychotherapy and the psychoanalytic theory, of clinical training and professional accreditation, of licensing by the colonizers within illegally occupied Jerusalem. Ali understands what Lara elsewhere calls ideological misattunement of his supervisors. This misattunement is not accidental, but serves willfully and unconsciously very real, pointed ideological ends, both towards the Arab trainee and the Arab patient. Ali further recounts his experience in supervision, locating not only the settler colonial spatiality of training, but also the language one is forced to speak to achieve accreditation. And when I say language, I mean both symbolically and the colonizer's tongue. And as well as the assignments which the settlers delegate to Arab trainees. You are an Arab therapist. You are charged to treat Arabs in East Jerusalem in Arabic, the marginalized and weak population subject to occupation, he tells us. You are sent to treat them with texts written in Hebrew. You present the case of your patient in Hebrew to your Israeli supervisor. She lives in a colony on the land of your grandfather. She finds it hard to understand you, although she reassures you that she cares about the Arabs. She can't see any need for the therapeutic intervention with this patient because he is low functioning, or in her words, quote, the patient is a simpleton. Ali makes us understand that in which Palestinian trainees, acknowledged only as Arabs, are operationalized to extend the sovereignty of the settler colonial state and reproduce captive settler colonial citizen subjects' lack of interiority. Ali was fully aware and disturbed that he was required to reproduce settler colonial legitimacy and the relations that naturalize it. This is how settler colonial ideology works, where one set of techniques that pathologizes the patient is prioritized over the other. For example, listening in Arabic, speaking in Arabic, and acknowledging the material reality of both the patient and the clinician. Like the inability of recognizing the old Arab home where supervision takes place as a site of psychic violence, of theft, of dispossession, all that was legible to the supervisor, who sees herself as sympathetic to the Arabs, is the primitiveness of the Palestinian patient. In another conversation, Ali describes to us another Israeli supervisor who insisted, despite no supporting clinical material over a significantly lengthy treatment period, that Ali diagnosed the patient from Shu'afat with a psychotic disorder. While Ali attempted to showcase how his diagnosis was in fact clinically counterindicated, how this diagnosis was counterindicated, the Israeli supervisor insisted. Her rationale was that the patient, who had considerable technical computer training, was grandiose. And he was trying to create a computer that would surpass current computer processors in use. In the supervisor's assessment, this clearly meant that the Palestinian patient must be psychotic. Contrary to the supervisor's opinion, Ali found the patient not only non-psychotic, but actually cogent and remarkably intelligent. Ali remembers trying to convince his supervisor, he says, of his clinical position and rationale, aware of and conflicted in his attempts to do so because of the power imbalance between supervisor and supervisee. She replied to him, "There's no way that this guy can actually be doing this. He must be psychotic. There is no way he actually knows how to work computers." Ali confided in us his shock that the supervisor could not reconcile, quote, her Orientalist ideas about Arabs, saying, quote, the supervisor was Israeli. She couldn't understand how an Arab could be smart, like a stereotype of an Arab who was a nobody. Ali understands how the Israeli supervisor's ideological misattunement reproduces captive settler colonial subjects as ineffable, as lacking in order to evince the superiority and fullness of the Israeli settler's subjectivity. Ali identifies this shortcoming not as a personal trait of his supervisor alone, but as a built-in feature of the social relations between the colonized and the settler citizen, between the Israeli clinical supervisor and the Palestinian trainee. He says, to get your license, you have to do an oral exam in Hebrew in front of a board of all Jewish Israeli doctors. How do you think they look at an Arab candidate? You have to make sure that you speak perfectly. They will find fault, of course, not because you don't speak well, but because you are an Arab. You have to humiliate yourself. If you have a license, they want you to make sure to show you who is the ruling class. He concludes his story by saying, they look at you, you are less than, you know less, your culture is less, and yet they teach us, he says. They teach us, and across the street, only a few meters away, is another stolen house, Edward Said's house, and they have no clue. They see us as if we come from nowhere. They want to give us the honor of being trained by them so as to help us treat our people, unquote. These are the social relations and ideological valence that authorize the legitimacy of the settler state through consent and collusion of psychologists, psychoanalytic theory, and structures of clinical training. The multiplicities that structure the social and professional relations between the colonized political Palestinian trainee and the Israeli settler supervisor, not to mention the Palestinian patient, are marked by an essential ideological disavowals. Ali realizes that the Palestinian trainee is required to accept and reproduce these disavowals. The Palestinian trainee is expected to be a good Arab, an appreciative Arab, a Hebrew-speaking Arab, not a bad Palestinian, primitive, Arabic-speaking, and ungrateful, as Fanon shows us. As a Palestinian captive settler colonial citizen from a village immediately outside of Jerusalem, Ali experiences the disciplinary demands of his professional training and the relationship between the supervisor trainee differently from settler citizens. The humiliation upon him should not be lost in the pupil's archetypal subordination to the teacher. Rather, sort of like a Rancière sort of thing. Rather, the humiliation of the self-negation form a psychological structure of subordination. The trainee-supervisory relationship is governed by a settler colonial system, an ideological system of imposed sovereignty over psychology, and by extension, over psychoanalysis as a clinical practice. This sovereignty cannot be separated from the ideology and apparatus of the same settler colonial regime that rules over occupied Jerusalem, where Ali works, as well as all parts of occupied Palestine from the river to the sea. When Ali seeks to practice therapy in service of Palestinian mental health, his psychoanalytic supervisor falls back on CBT, despite otherwise deriding behaviorist therapy. This is how ideology works. Ali is told quite specifically that his patient lacks the capacity, unquote, for long-term therapy. In many ways, he himself is made to feel that he's in a parallel process, that he too lacks capacity. Alienation is built into the training site, the training process, training material, and supervision. It is to be passed on from the colonized supervisor to the patient through the supervisee. That is hegemony. His only point of entry is that of an obsequious good Arab who can translate the lack of interiority of the Arab back into the depths and complexities of Hebrew in service of managing the Arab's primitivity into sedate compliance. Ali's experiences present a series of problems and challenges faced by Palestinian clinicians under Israeli political hegemony and settler colonial rule, and how it aims to reproduce settler colonial legitimacy and degrade Palestinian selves. It is important now to note, before I pass this over to Lara, that the central point of our book, however, is how Palestinian clinicians and Palestinians themselves work to resist this settler colonial hegemony. Our research then hopes to shine light on how Palestinians, circumscribed by violence and death, operate internally and communally, individually and collectively, with a psychic political economy, within a psychic political economy of life. This psychic political economy of life defies being objectified as victim and seeks to maintain, even though tragic, desperate, and in some ways heroic ways, their dignity, commitment, and responsibility to themselves and others. We build on the insights of Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian about how psychic political power, as she says, emanates from what she calls sites of death that generate a collective, quote, a collective psychosocial embodiment of everyday resistance. More specifically, we identify how psychosocial practices of Palestinians through the experiences, analysis, and techniques of clinicians affirm the centrality of an embodied psyche, a nafas, a breath of self, as the primary site for Palestinian life, willfulness, and resistance. Now, Lara.
Whew. All right. I mean, I co-wrote the book, but hearing it out loud is something else. So I just want to say also before I jump in that our Palestinian colleagues are here with us, and this book is theirs. It's theirs in every way. These are their voices, and we did that with intentionality. This is not something we created or excavated. Their generosity goes beyond. So I just want to keep centering that. And everything we share in the book and here has been a process of community building that continues to this day. And their permission to share these stories as well. Consent is a huge part of this, especially with the complications of living under settler colonial regimes. So picking up where Stephen left off, I want to again center the work and practice of sumud, stalwartness or steadfastness, and resistance by one of our clinician comrade colleagues who generously shared of herself and her work, and that's Yoad, who's here with us today, and I'm so grateful for that. As in other examples in the book, the clinical cases we platform are a jumping off point. Rather than engage in the maneuver of psychoanalytic innocence, an example of which you just heard from Stephen, right, with Ali's supervisor, and I'll speak a little bit more to psychoanalytic innocence, where the content alone comes to hold the energetic pull of clinical attention. I want to focus us on the both andness that Palestinian clinicians consistently alert us to. That is how their clinical work comes to be both a space for resistance for their patients and also an extension of their own resistance against settler colonial hegemony. Indeed, what we consistently came upon in our work alongside our comrades was that a collective practice is unified through precisely its engagement with creating and maintaining life and life worlds, as Stephen just said, as well as political and historical realities for Palestinians by Palestinians. The following clinical example was shared by Yoad. a brilliant clinician and wonderful revolutionary soul who holds captive settler colonial citizenship in the Zionist state. After meeting Youad in Beit Hanina, we continued to have conversations with her and witnessed her speaking publicly and in psychoanalytic groups over subsequent years, conversations that only increased our admiration for her critical insights and her depths of empathy. And I hope this is something she knows without me having to say it. One particular case she shared with us that has stuck with me is that of Amjad, and this is a pseudonym, of course, a man in his early 30s who worked in an Israeli textile company inside the 1948 borders of the state now known as Israel. Though he had a home in the West Bank, Amjad, along with his 3 children and wife, who was a homemaker, rented a house in an officially annexed village near Kalandia out of fear of losing his identity card that allowed him to live and work in Jerusalem. Amjad visited the clinic as he suffered from sensations of a lump or a ball, in Arabic tabi, in his throat whenever he became nervous. Amjad had undergone many medical tests to establish treatment for what he felt was a medical condition, though each medical consultation indicated that his throat was, quote, 100% normal. After a year, one of Amjad's physicians suggested that he seek help from a psychologist. Amjad was initially very embarrassed in the clinical space. And as I'm recounting this, these are Youad's words entrusted to us, and found difficulty speaking about himself, as well as anything beyond what he continued to feel must be a medical condition. He explained that there were days when he felt the ball in his throat was getting bigger, while other days he felt it getting smaller. Youad asked him to share with her his reflections and observations about what sometimes made the pain increase to such a degree that he was barely able to speak. She shared with us that he often entered her room with a shy smile and initially waited for her to start speaking. She characterized him as someone who took great care in arranging his sentences and words to make himself understandable. Youad also indicated that he would often display great difficulty producing words, often experiencing word-finding difficulties, and showed signs of obsessiveness in searching for correct phrasing. She told us that as a result, early in their sessions, Amjad mumbled very short sentences, speaking in choppy words and broken phrases. He would tell her, quote, "My words stop in my throat. They knot up and become a ball in my throat. They suffocate me when they do not come out," end quote. Amjad was annoyed with himself, and Youad shared with us that she felt that too. She also often felt the ball move from his throat into her stomach, a knot she could not release. Amjad's therapy with Youad spanned approximately 1.5 years of weekly sessions. She reported initially having been supervised, as in the case we heard from Ali and countless other Palestinians under settler colonial captive citizenship, supervised by an Israeli Jewish psychologist. Youad noted that while the lore of the institution was such that everyone held themselves to professional standards and believed in the fundamental premises of psychoanalytic theory and practice, she often sensed this collapse of psychic space when her Israeli supervisors, especially in the case of Amjad, tried to theorize Palestinian patients seen by Palestinian clinicians. In the case of Amjad, rather than being curious about the psychoanalytic meanings of Amjad's symptoms, the supervisor insisted that Amjad suffered from an anxiety disorder and that only medication could solve his problem. Youad felt deeply conflicted by this assessment as she relayed her gut feeling, or what we might read as a tuned clinical intuition, that Amjad likely had much more to say. She feared that medicine would potentially preemptively shut Amjad and his exploratory process down and foreclose opportunities to collaboratively read the symptoms as signs of a deeper communication about his experience and being. Sounds familiar, right? I mean, like it's psychoanalysis. Youad recalled disagreeing with her supervisor openly, despite being painfully aware of the power differential and the potential implications of doing so, which is a theme that we heard over and again. She insisted that she could continue to be curious with Amjad about what he was trying to communicate in the displacement, in the countertransferential space, in the dyad, even if this was not explicitly articulated. This, of course, represented an alignment with psychoanalytic tradition and technique in which she and her supervisor were both trained. Despite this, her supervisor insisted on psychiatric intervention. and therefore Yuad suggested that he consult a psychiatrist, an intervention that ultimately pacified her supervisor, but which Amjad refused. Despite refusing medication, or perhaps as we learned from Yuad, because he refused medication, Yuad noted that Amjad went from barely speaking to exquisite detailing of his many concerns, his fatigue from work, thoughts about his children, concerns regarding the relationship with his wife, struggles of travel through checkpoints, and his relationship with his brothers. Yuad tells us that she felt confused about the purpose of these details. She understood their literal meaning, but often found herself affectively discombobulated, wondering what he needed from her. She also came to feel suffocated, in her words. She reported feeling frustrated, as though Amjad had escaped from previous silences into speaking so much that no room was left, even for breathing. As such, she often had the feeling of the room being heavy with thoughts and words that were left unsaid, though they were very much present. In this, she reflected how both silence and speech can be defensive, used to fill up the space, but never reaching the depths of the patient or the clinician, a good psychoanalytic clinician. While Yuad was committed to and engaged in intensive self-reflection herself of the work, she reported that her Israeli supervisor often downplayed her approach and considered her surface work with Amjad as a great success, because Amjad had become comfortable with her. Her supervisor also dismissed concern about Yuad's countertransference and was not curious about Yuad's feeling that Amjad, quote, was making a lot of noise with no depth, end quote. Yuad was especially concerned as the ball in his throat lightened as he spoke, but immediately returned and grew whenever the session ended. She felt that she and Amjad were playing a game of negotiation, and yet in reality, there was no solution. Yuad shared with us that often she was confronted with conflicts regarding how to speak about the work with Amjad and supervision. She noted the psychoanalytic importance of having associated to negotiations, especially in the context of Palestine. While she understood intuitively that associations had meaning, especially in the countertransference, Yuad found herself at a loss of how to express this concern to her supervisor, especially as the supervisor did not share Yuad's concerns. Amjad himself was happy that he did not feel any discomfort in his throat during the sessions. However, he stated that outside the clinic, his painful feelings returned and he was unable to get rid of the ball. Yuad noted that this was an important turning point in treatment, as it opened up a space for her to ask him about breathing in real time without being bogged down only by talking. More specifically, she told us that with this opening in the material, she'd asked him to put aside the distracting notes he had taken to bringing into session and talk about his difficulty in breathing, with specific focus on when he was feeling suffocated. While he initially did not answer her directly, Yuad shared with us that he was smiling in his silence, and she felt it was important to self-disclose in service of the clinical process. Specifically, she shared with him that she sometimes felt suffocated in sessions because of over-talking that seemed to leave little, if any, room for anything else. She told us that he again smiled, and he indicated that as his feeling of suffocation increased, it turned into a ball in his throat that suffocated him. Yuad worked with Amjad to uncover and recount all the moments in which he had felt suffocated. When his wife reminded him of payments for the pathetic car he had bought, when he passed in front of his closed house in the West Bank, when his Israeli boss asked him to bring him fresh olive oil from their tree, which was in the West Bank, when he entered the area controlled by the Palestinian Authority, another part of his own country, and he read the sign, "No crossing border, dangerous area." In every session after that pivotal moment, Amjad talked about the specifics of his breathing difficulties and sighed a lot as he did so. At this point, her supervisor indicated abruptly that it was time for Yuad to terminate Amjad's treatment, because she was happy with the achievement he had made and felt that there was no further growth or depth to explore. Yuad told us that she remembered feeling very upset about this decision, especially as she had just started to experience an important affective shift in the room. Because in the moment, She felt she did not have the power to do otherwise. She initially followed her supervisor's advice and told Amjad that they needed to move to termination. Yuad recounted how Amjad surprisingly exploded, shouting in a way she could never have previously imagined. While yelling, Amjad told her she was weak and that she was, quote, not the one who owns the decision or the decision-making process, end quote. He continued, accusing her of, quote, not really being concerned with taking care of and protecting sick people, end quote. Yuad remembers being shocked by the fact that he was screaming and that she did not fully understand what was happening in that exact moment, nor did she have the space to reflect fully about her countertransference, but she knew internally she felt very happy. After this moment, Yuad made the decision to continue Amjad's treatment alone without consulting her supervisor any further. While in future sessions, they did not explicitly talk about Amjad's outburst, she noted that she had started to feel that he had become taller, as if his stature had gotten bigger. During this phase of treatment, Amjad started talking very openly about anger. More specifically, he spoke about getting angry inside his car, the lousy car in which he crossed the Kalandia checkpoint twice a day, once on his way to work and once on his way back. Amjad reported getting angry in his car whenever he read the word Ma'bar, checkpoint crossing, on a sign. He reported feeling anger because he didn't feel like he was just crossing from one area to another. Rather, he felt that he was inside one space, but was prohibited from free movement in another while standing at a checkpoint. This is Amjad. Why do they call it a crossing? He said angrily. This is a checkpoint, a hajiz, a checkpoint, a checkpoint. In a session soon after, he began to uncover his anger. Yuad reminded him that they had not spoken about the ball in his throat for quite some time, inquiring where it was and if it remained a symptom for him. She recalled Amjad stating, quote, sometimes I feel that there is a hate or hatefulness in my throat and not a ball in my throat. This is when she decided to ask him who he hated, to which he responded, I hate myself. After a moment of silence, Yuad said Amjad opened up about an incident that had happened 2 years prior. He said that he had taken his 7-year-old daughter in the morning with him on his way to work, as she'd wanted to meet with a friend in Jerusalem. He remembered that his daughter was very happy that morning, as she'd been fantasizing about this magical day with her friend for quite some time. He recalled that she wore a beautiful new dress the night before out of excitement and put flowers in her hair the morning they set out. Amjad further shared that his daughter was singing throughout the trip in the car, bouncy, bouncy, bouncy ball, bouncy, bouncy over the wall. When they reached the Kalandia checkpoint, Amjad was surprised to see tear gas and a confrontation between the occupation army and protesters. Worried about his daughter, he tried to reverse, but his car was stuck in the midst of hundreds of cars, all trapped motionless. The situation was increasingly frightful for a quarter of an hour, after which it completely calmed down. But the occupation soldiers closed the checkpoint and prevented the cars from moving, as happens very often. Amjad recalled that his daughter began to cry uncontrollably during this time, and that he was hugging her the entire time, trying to calm her and contain her fear. Eventually, she told her father she needed to use the bathroom. Amjad was not convinced that they would be allowed to access a bathroom, but got out of his car to inquire, as his daughter's crying was escalating, and he could tell she was in considerable discomfort. Amjad told Yuad that he waved down a settler soldier, telling him, my daughter needs a bathroom. Instead of responding to him, the soldiers ran towards him with their weapons raised. He said, I raised my hands towards the sky and shouted at them, she wants a bathroom, please let me pass. The settler soldiers yelled, get back in your car, get back, get in the car. Tell your daughter to piss herself in the car. All the while, his daughter continued to cry, Baba, Baba, I need a bathroom. Amjad recalled getting back in his car, hugging his daughter, and with a trembling voice telling her, do it here, Baba, do it quietly here in the car. He remembered how at that moment, his daughter's screaming stopped as the smell of urine spread. Amjad looked at his daughter and found her shedding silent tears. He hugged her as he drove them home, and as he looked at the checkpoint gate, he remembered the cheerful song of his daughter at the beginning of the day, bouncy, bouncy over the wall. We are not you, ball, after which he immediately felt a ball stuck in his throat. Yoad remembered how Amjad finished describing the incident and witnessed tears flowing down his cheeks for the first time. She remembered tears rolling down her own cheeks as well, as she also became aware of what she calls a wheel in my throat as they ended the session. I'm just going to take a moment to breathe. Yeah. Yoad, are you okay? Good. Okay. This case is super important for many reasons, not the least of which is the exquisite distilling of the banality of violence enacted daily on Palestinians, whether patients or clinicians. Yoad tells us that Amjad's treatment was one that she'll never forget, ever in her life. She confided in us, saying, "I often remember Amjad. It guides me professionally, privately. It changed me in the way that I practice." The effect of this case on Yoad is what we focus on in our book, and I'm hoping here too. It encapsulates the condition of the Palestinian as an extension into the clinical and the clinical into the personal and social. But more specifically, it allows us an opportunity to acknowledge how Palestinian clinicians refuse to erase the signs of Zionist settler colonialism embodied in the clinical space, both in the therapist and the patient, no matter the systemic pressure or the demands from supervisors, for example, to reduce patients and clinicians into primarily behavioral beings with no depth and interiority. In a depoliticized condition, one might say that Amjad's psychological symptoms are experienced physically without any medical basis. The Israeli supervisor identifies the symptom as a conversion symptom, as a symptom of an anxiety disorder. She sees him primarily as a resistant patient who refuses to speak, to articulate thoughts, or to open up and be honest. We call this, myself and Leilani Salvo-Crane, as ideological misattunement that saturates psychoanalytic thought, analysis, and treatment. An inability to identify processes precisely because the analyst or clinician is implicated by and imbricated in the ideological matrix in which the patient is also entangled. This exemplifies what we have termed in this book psychoanalytic innocence. Psychoanalytic innocence works in concert with the logic of settler colonialism and occupation, denying the everyday violence enacted on Palestinians and conveniently forgetting how this is also structured by the unconscious. Deployed in this way, psychoanalytic innocence is particularly insidious because it simultaneously forfeits psychoanalysis' supposition of unconscious process and structure while also ignoring material reality. Psychoanalytic innocence pervades the ideological position of the practice, the theory, and therefore the relational space of psychoanalysis in Palestine and in every other settler colonial condition. To bring it back to our talk today, if following Fanon and others, we understand psychoanalysis as being primarily a method and practice of reading, organizing, and translating the unconscious individually as well as collectively and socially, then the mechanics of psychoanalytic innocence work to at once obfuscate this process and insist on the fact that obfuscation is not happening. So therefore, it maintains innocence. This process is not individual, as Ali also knew, or individualized, but rather is structural and is a constitutive piece of theory and practice deployed to preserve psychoanalytic practice as is, especially in the settler colony. Here, I would also like to draw our attention to how liberal and humanistic psychoanalysis maintains this naturalization, remaining complicit through forms of oppression by seeking to graft a universalized, healthy adaptability onto colonial and racialized subjects whose humanity and psychic interiority are negated. In a liberalized version of psychoanalytic theory, these colonial subjects are only able to access empathy when they occupy the position of victim and surrender their rights to experience political and material realities in full alignment with their experience and social context. Yoad's supervisor attempts to mobilize psychoanalytic innocence, just like all the other supervisors we heard of, because it's structural. And like all of the Palestinian clinicians alongside whom we learned so much, Yoad was a willful subject engaging in the politics of refusal, a Palestinian clinician unwilling to succumb to the colonial violence inflicted on her as a clinician or on her patient in alignment with her ethical codes, and on Amjad, a Palestinian clinician insisting on indigenous Palestinian presence, even in the face of settler aggression that insists on erasing the native, whether in their personal life or on the couch. To the Israeli settler, in this case a supervisor, Amjad's silence could only be a defense, a deflection from confronting the unconscious. Without attending to the structural and material realities of his world as a Palestinian, she reads his symptoms as just nerves that can be medicated. If we were to collude with psychoanalytic innocence, we might mistake this supervisor's racist and colonial aggression as a disaggregated singular act of random violence rather than a central part of a coordinated system of violence, oppression, and erasure perpetrated by the settler state of Israel, here manifesting in the supervisory space. In this way, Yoad also alerts us to the importance of the Palestinian body, individually and collectively, as a site of violence, as well as a site of resistance and sociability. And that's the real takeaway here. The somatization then is not a symptom of a disorder. Rather, it is a symptom of functioning within the reality principle that stops up the flow of the unconscious, the social, and the intersubjective. Amjad's symptom, confronted and read through the context of Palestinian intersubjectivity, then not only directs us to the settler colonial condition, but also makes us consider how the occupation might manifest itself, or perhaps can only manifest itself, for example, here within the context of Palestinian masculinity through somatization. Otherwise, it might be dismissed or minimalized. And this is the way that settler colonialism works with patriarchy, for example, or toxic masculinity. There's no place for a Palestinian speaking subject in the settler colonial regime. Therefore, the suffocating ball itself is not the only symptom, something which Yoad recognized from day one. While she could see this as a Palestinian colonial subject clinician herself, the symptoms were illegible to the ideologically misattuned Israeli supervisor. The symptom of silence and empty speech signified the loss of the ability to speak deeply in Yoad's language, to articulate meaning, as well as a blockage to affectively express the damage inflicted on the interior self by the daily violence of occupation. I personally think that the supervisor was also afraid to hear what the violence was, and so actively suppressed that articulation. We can then understand Yoad's decision to continue working with Amjad, despite her supervisor indicating she couldn't or shouldn't, as a liberatory and ethical imperative that most movingly disrupts the settlers' insistence on futurity. Instead, in making this decision, Yoad demonstrates for us that she saw his symptoms as a hajiz, a checkpoint, a barrier, just as he did, just as we do in everyday life of Palestinians, just as all our clinician colleagues tell us. In this way, she actively disrupts settler colonial logics and insists on indigenous presence. Thank you.
Well, we are all muted, but I think Tina, you should unmute everybody and share a big applause to Lara and Stephen. Can you do that, Tina? I don't know. If not, please allow me to thank you, and I think the audience is also thanking you. I think we need a little bit of silence, but technology doesn't allow us. Actually, I have a question for you. How do we feel? Maybe we want to share this into the chat or when we talk. I tell you how I feel. I feel I feel little and I feel helpless. Let me do this. And angry. Okay, we are more than 50. I am now opening the floor to everybody, really to everybody. There are many, many interesting colleagues, people, friends in the audience. Let's do it this way. If you have a question, if you have a comment, whatever, please use the function raise your hand, and I will call your name so that we can do this a little bit with order. Thank you again, Lara and Stephen, for sharing this with us.
I see a question in the chat from Hiba.
Yeah, I'm going down, but why can't I see the chat box? Well, whoever have a question is from Eba. Eba, unmute yourself if you are muted and go on.
Thank you, Stephen and Lara. I mean, it's nothing really new for me, but it's to hear it this way and to see Yuad in the audience, deeply moved, and thank you. Thank you for saying no to the supervisor and continuing to work yourself with your patient. That's really what resistance is to occupation. My question is, would you please elaborate on the history of psychoanalysis in Palestine and how connected to political Zionism has it been? Thank you.
Sure. I'll just briefly, that's a big question. I'll just briefly answer that in a couple ways. One of which is it's intimately, psychoanalysis is intimately at one level entangled within the history of Zionism and settler colonial project. A lot of the earlier, pre-Nakba Zionists were somehow connected to Freud and some directly, or to his circle. I do have and of course, in terms of Jewish science, et cetera, but I do have one hesitation that I think we make an assertion in the book, is that the history of psychoanalysis is written in a way that there's no place for Arab. That actually reproduces the way in which psychoanalysis is practiced in the settler colony and elsewhere. Because if you read someone like Omni al-Shakri's work, there's actually a tradition of Arab engagement with psychology and psychoanalytic theory. It's diffuse and pushed aside and marginalized, but it's there. And that also happens to be connected with what was happening in Palestine as well. But of course, to talk about the history of Arab psychoanalysis or Arab psychology, or Palestinian psychology, I should say, we have to connect it with Arab psychology, right? So there's a sort of a way in which we have to resist the Zionist project of not allowing Arab to use Palestinian, but also only terming them as Arab to erase their Palestinianness. Because in the end, Palestinians are Arab, and they're part of a larger Arab world. This Arab world was, dismembered under colonial violence with Sykes-Picot and the Balfour Declaration. So when we think about the history of Arab psychoanalysis, we have to think about Palestine in the context of its natural context that was violated but through colonialism in the 20th century. So I would like to say, yes, certainly psychoanalysis is intricately interwoven into the settler colonial Zionist settler process. Israeli psychologists maintain hegemony over psychoanalysis because it's the Jewish science and because Zionists want to claim propriety over all things Jewish. But on the other hand, I would also push back and say psychoanalysis has a tradition in Arab Palestine, that is always being pushed aside, buried, and it's our work to try to find those pedigrees and those histories.
And what I would say is that you don't have to look very far. Our clinician comrades are practicing psychoanalysis every day, right? And this is, as somebody who teaches psychoanalytic theory, it's a matter of what psychoanalysis becomes legible and what not. What is purely psychoanalysis and what is not psychoanalysis? And what our Palestinian colleagues practice every day is this indigenous psychoanalysis, and it's an indigenous Palestinian psychoanalysis that has been written out. And so it becomes an overlay, just like settler colonialism becomes an overlay over Palestine in the present, not just as a past. We see the same thing happening with psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic theory. So there's always this question of, well, what does psychoanalysis look like in Palestine? Is it different than a psychoanalysis in that? And, you know, obviously the complexities of social location are always different, but it is a matter of what are the structural ways in which we see certain psychoanalysis, structures of psychoanalysis, and we unsee or displace or forget entirely what has long been a practice and a renegotiation constantly of what psychoanalytic practice looks like.
If I can add something on this, of course, psychoanalysis is a very clear term. I really like to use another term that is psychagogia. It means accompaniment. And what you describe is really this. The therapist accompanied the patient. We don't know where. Maybe it's successful, maybe it's not successful, but maybe also changing the terms might help. Flavia Donati just shared a comment. Flavia, would you like to share this with everyone? If you can unmute yourself.
I have to, my note was that years ago, a young Palestinian psychologist, very active in Gaza and the occupied territories, but asked me, at the time I was in the International Psychoanalytic Society, the Freudian one, about possible training in Israel. And I knew some of the colleagues I had there, and I said that I thought it was impossible to have training by the occupiers, however friendly they looked. So we were looking, we tried to discuss at ways in which he could access some training. But are there now possibilities that then were not possible?
Thank you for the question. And I also would just want to note that I feel like there's still a lot of affect in the room, so I will invite that as well. But yes, so let me start off by saying that if there's a dearth or what might be seen as a lack of psychoanalytic training within historic Palestine, it is not because Palestinians don't know psychoanalysis. It's because the logics of settler colonialism make it such that the Israeli state owns all the institutes and sort of lays claim, like Stephen was just saying, about who practices and trains legitimate psychoanalysts and who doesn't. So that's number one. It's naming the condition that would say that the only way to be a certified or bona fide analyst is through under occupation, right, under the conditions of occupation. One of the most wonderful things about doing this work in Palestine alongside our colleagues is learning of the extensive work that Palestinian clinicians have been doing for years. We did not, again, this is what we say, we didn't invent this. We came in and they generously shared all the practices and the clinics that they have been working on and the networks that they have forged across historic Palestine, despite the checkpoints, despite the apartheid wall, despite the violence that is done. Every day they've been working on this process. So, but in our one of our chapters, we actually detail all the clinics across historic Palestine that have been working on this, culminating, and I'll let our Palestinian colleagues also speak to this more, they're here, in a global Palestine mental health network. That the sort of stance of that is that at this point in time, we can no longer just rely on the settler state to offer trainings, to offer, to narrate the experience of Palestinians and Palestinian clinicians. And so these clinicians across historic Palestine and in the diaspora have come together and made a network where they speak and narrate their own experience and do trainings. Many of you might have attended some of these trainings and have heard them speak to their own experiences. There is one clinic in Nazareth, in Nasira, the Ma'na clinic, that is led by Najla Al-Asmar and Mustafa Qasuqsi, and they are right now the only Arab-speaking clinic in settler and under settler colonialism that teaches psychoanalytically oriented clinical training in Arabic to Palestinian clinicians. And that is something that might not have been there, Flavia, at the time that your colleague was asking. But this comes from this sort of arriving at a place where this is no longer sustainable. The idea of being trained under these conditions and having to, by virtue of being trained under these conditions, having to compromise one's self, one's selfhood, and consistently be humiliated in these examples that we've been given, that is where that emerges from. And the work that is being done is incredible and speaks for itself.
Thank you. Tristan. Can you mute yourself, please? Yeah.
Yes. Okay, wait a minute.
We can hear you.
Okay. I am an Israeli psychoanalyst. I came from South America as an immigrant a long time ago. I would, first of all, I'm grateful to Stephen and Lara for your deep and honest presentation. It was very painful to hear, but I'm used to hear painful stories. I work as a volunteer in the Israeli Public Committee Against Torture. And I work there as a psychiatrist, generally, and I can call myself a witness of the enormous suffering that Palestinians go under occupation, and hear the detailed stories of humiliation, beatings, torture, and which are very typical of this situation. Relating to the to your presentation, I would like to say that as an in front of Palestinians, I feel like an anti-colonialist colonizer. I know that my Palestinian colleagues and Palestinians living under occupation, nothing will help. They will see me as a representative of colonialism. But I want to say there are quite a few Israelis that try to cross the border. The border, not only the borders built by checkpoints, but also the borders that are created by paternalism and seeing the Palestinians are as inferior sometimes, not very differently to how Israeli Oriental Jews that came from Arab countries, and in the past they called themselves Arab Jews. Sometimes I looked as paternalistic. I dealt with paternalism. I would like to say to Stephen that I think you paint things in black and white. I think, let me say that the occupation for me is a black and white issue. But when you talk about settler psychoanalysts, or I think there are many Israeli psychoanalysts that they would like to have Palestinian candidates in their associations and relate to them as equal. Maybe it's impossible, I think, but there are quite a lot of people like me that that try to do their best. I organized together with other Israeli mental health professionals meetings with Palestinian mental health professionals. Not all of them were ready to participate in these meetings. This was in the occupied West Bank. But
just a second. I'm just sort of mindful of the time. Would you mind if we answered and then give other people a chance? And if you still have something else, follow up.
Okay. I just want to say that I would like to, I don't deny the terrible situation of colonialism, but I would like you to leave some space for Israelis to relate, to try at least to relate differently to Palestinian patients and colleagues. That's what I would like to say.
You want to go first?
I'll go first only because I don't miss some money. Sorry.
Okay.
Just
talk
very,
as a clinician.
I'll let Lara talk as a clinician, but because you mentioned me, I'll just there are a number of things that you invite me to address. So I'm going to try to be brief and keep it simple, because settler colonial processes are built to draw ourselves away from attending to the colonized. And these discussions invite us then to decenter Palestinians from the conversation. That is why in this book that we write, we actually are unequivocal about the violence that dialogue initiatives, no matter how wonderful and warm and fuzzy they sound, invariably reinscribe and ensure and work towards settler colonial futures and presence. Samah Jabbar has a famous interview, and she repeated it to us actually in the conversation, where she says that every time she's in a conversation with the the good Israelis, right? Because there's the good Israelis who recognize that there are Palestinians. Well, thank you very much. That they say, we just need space to talk. But every time an Israeli talks and a Palestinian in the room, they leave no air for Palestinians. When Israelis talk, even about Israelis, they basically suffocate the Palestinians. So I want to just always refocus on the settler colonial subject, Palestinians, the indigenous people of Palestine. I also want to clarify something. When we speak of Palestine, we are talking about what is now is now the state now known as Israel. When we talk about occupation, we're talking about Safad, Nasira, Haifa, Yafa, Ramli, Lid. This is what we talk about. So I want to keep us centered on Palestinian life and not, as Golda Meir said, the suffering of the Israelis who had to inflict violence, who hate themselves because they had to inflict violence on the Palestinians. And only to say this, and I don't mean to relieve anyone's guilt for sure, it's just to say that what we're saying is all solutions and all processes are collective. Ilana Lach is an Israeli, and I would go into the
trenches.
Into the trenches with her.
Into
the trenches with her. She's amazing, but
she's in our association.
We are talking about collective issues here, and not individuals, which distract us from thinking about Palestinian conditions.
Which comes into what I was going to say, and then I see several hands up, so I'm going to shift directly to you, Yad, when I'm done here. But I want to just pick up, and I'm speaking as a clinician here, and I'm speaking as a clinician who's talking on occupied land in a settler colonial condition. And what I consistently tell my students when I supervise them from a psychoanalytic perspective. You said that the Palestinian clinician or supervisee or patient might see you as a representative of the Israeli state. You are a representative of the Israeli state.
They see me as the...
Yes, but let me finish.
They do.
Exactly, because you are. And I think that's okay for us as clinicians. This is what we mean by material reality. And that you will always be a settler in Palestine. You might be a settler on the right side of history, fighting for Palestinian liberation, but that does not eliminate the material reality that you are a settler in a land that was stolen from Palestinians. Much like I am a settler in this settler colony, there is nothing that detracts from my dedication to land back efforts, to Al-Auda, to everything that I fight alongside my indigenous siblings here in the settler colony. But it detracts from material reality if I get into the practice of saying I am not a settler just because I'm fighting those battles. And I think that's important. It's important for us as supervisors. I'm speaking to the clinicians in the room right now. When we hear these stories of supervisors, there is a seduction to separate ourselves and call on our goodness and that we are not that. But when we are talking structurally, there are settlers and there are indigenous people, and that is not splitting. That is a reality principle, and that's okay. It's okay for us to contend with that. I'm going to shift to Yad now. Your hand's been up for a while.
مساء الخير للجميع. لارا وستيفان وأصحابي وزملائي بفلسطين ملي ورنا وهبة وجميعكم. Thank you all. Thank you, Lara and Stefan, for the super touching input that you gave. It was extremely moving hearing you. Shukran كتير. I want to highlight the fact that actually through the treatment of our clients, actually it's not only that we heal them, but they heal us as well, as they help us to be very much aware of internalizing the colonizations within our personalities as the psychoanalysts and therapists. And it's very important to me to say that everything I've learned in regarding ethical psychoanalysis, I learned from my Palestinian colleagues. I was working more than 20 years and still working within a Palestinian NGO active in Jerusalem for more than 35 years now. And we are practicing in this Palestinian NGO an ethical psychoanalysis. This type of psychoanalysis, Palestinian psychoanalysis, help us to understand, help me to understand that we can't look to the symptoms regardless from the surrounding. And any symptom of our patients, it must be looked as a part of a colonial context, exactly as the story of Amjad. And actually, majority of the patient's symptoms are normal symptoms to an abnormal continuous situation. So these symptoms are really signs of refusal. And this refusal and resistance is very much healthy. And we can't heal our patients without healing the surrounding, without healing the roots of these symptoms. And the roots, of course, are colonization and occupation. Nowadays, as Palestinians, we are trying to be active collectively to resist to this colonization system that makes or creates all this, the symptomology of the Palestinians. So it's the context that we need to heal, not only the person. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoad.
Do you want to add something? Otherwise, I would suggest, I don't know who raised the hand first, so I apologize.
It's in order on Zoom.
So Razan, Nora, and Andrew, and perhaps then we see if we want to wrap up or continue.
Hello, مرحبا. شكرا كثير يعاد وعلي and Dr. Sheehi for really just making space for this and putting it into text. I feel has been very inspiring. I am currently a doctoral student, so I'm very much in the supervisee seat. I have 4 supervisors as of this moment. And I find that it's an interesting place to be. And I guess one response I want to share is that as a Palestinian currently on occupied Nakachank land, it's very interesting to me, even the words I choose to express this and describe it, of how often I'm being inundated and always kind of forced to understand and read into the interiority of the Israeli experience, whether that's through assigned course readings or whether that's how certain supervisors end up asking me if my positionality as a Palestinian born and raised and now come to the US for doctoral studies influences how I hear my Jewish clients or patients. And so I guess one thing I would say to the analyst that's from Occupied Palestine speaking, that I wonder what it was that pushed you to feel like you needed to state the black and whiteness of it. What of your fragility was moved or not fully metabolized to allow a deeper kind of just allowing the space to be one where we hear and witness and allow our practice to shed light on. You know, in a recent, as things were happening in Palestine over the summer, the psychology of women of the APA like chapters, there was this Dr. Julie Ansis that sent an invitation for the group to work on anti-Semitism. And so I was like, yeah, this is something I'd be interested in. I'm a member of the Psychology of Women chapter of APA. And I had to fill out a survey, and then I was excluded from attending these meetings based on the fact that I identified as Palestinian. That wasn't explicitly stated, but I had another friend that doesn't have those same demographics apply, and she was included in that space. And so I guess one question I have is like, why is it always on the side of us requesting Palestinians bend over backwards and fragment ourselves to feel legible? Sorry, I just heard a shriek. Yeah, that's where I'll leave it. And thank you again for all of your labor, emotionally, intellectually, and I'll say that affectually definitely moved me to tears. So thank you for that space.
Thank you. I feel like you answered the question, right? And I want to invite us to sit with the evocative statement that you just called us into. I don't feel a need to respond. I hope that all of us can hear what Razan has just said, that demonstrates the movement that happens, what we might call the settler moves to innocence that happens, and their embodied material, where they land on people. Razan is the person who is so generously shared with us right now. So I want to leave it at that.
And if before to give space to Nora, Razan, please join Analysis and Activism. It's not an IPA thing, but maybe we can have more discussion on that. Nora, it's up to you.
Echoing Razan's words, I mean, just putting all this into words has been so useful. I come at my question from an Arabic literary background, so I don't have some of the technical terminology, and I'll try to keep it brief because I know there are a lot of clinicians with excellent questions to ask. So you guys have talked about this sort of structural framework of psychoanalysis and the sort of inherent problems in there. And I have some more sort of digging down questions on the tools of psychoanalysis, right? The diagnostic frameworks, the interpretive frameworks that all sort of came out of a place and a time. And I'm wondering if you can share thoughts or examples of how some of those might or might not work when you talk about the sort of Palestinian psychoanalysts who are creating a Palestinian psychoanalytic kind of framework. Do some of those tools have to shift? How do they shift? How do you take the kind of toolkit that's been developed and transfer it over, or does it get thrown out the window? And what are the sort of mechanisms at work moving from the macro down through some of the toolkit? And thank you very much.
So Noura, I come from the same background as you, and I just want to alert you that you actually potentially threw in like a massive, like provocative bomb, because I'm supposed to be like, yeah, like Kleinian was the best, that's the way to go, that's what works, and that other Lacanian stuff doesn't, right? I will only say this, and this is not in the book, it's actually from our discussions that Lara and I have over toast and coffee, and it's just that we constantly are asked to think about whether or not psychoanalysis as a theoretical framework and a practice is inherently violent, inherently a tool of colonialism or not, right? And this is kind of also just what decolonial, I think, movements are thinking about how and when do we use theory and how do we actualize theory and enact theory, if it sounds Western or not Western. And I think what we try to do in this book is to, number one, is people like Yahad and Ali and Wadad who are here and so many others, they're incredibly competent therapists, which of course goes against the racist stereotype that Ali was talking about, right? That Ali is going there and is schooling his supervisors, plural, right? So at one level, so it's not about necessarily efficacy of treatment. It's precisely how theoretical deployment is always wrapped up in structures, mobilizations, enactments, materializations of power. And in this case, it's settler colonial power, right? So I do believe that there are some tenets of psychoanalysis that might be challenged. For me, myself, as a decolonial scholar, it's obsession with individual selves, right? It's moved to getting healthy people. And I think this is what Yaad was saying, that there is no healthy self. That itself, the monadic self, is actually a structure of violence, right? Alienated from everybody around them as a healthy goal. So I would just I don't know if this is too broad of an answer, but I just think what we're trying to do is think about how these clinicians actualize these tools, localize them, indigenize them, right, for their own communities, but also to stave off the violence in which they are constantly entangled and invited to reproduce. I don't know if that's too broad of an answer.
And I would just add, no, I like the answer very much. That's why I wrote a book with them.
I like you.
So what I would say also is that I've become really interested even in sort of contemporary psychoanalytic circles. And I think being in psychoanalytic spaces a lot, I'm always intrigued by how analysts will always displace like, oh, this school does this, but we don't, right? So the question is, when do psychoanalytic tools no longer have utility? And that's our clue about what is happening, right? When there's like a regression, and we hear this in Ali's stories or Niad's stories, when like even the pronounced psychoanalytic clinician forgets psychoanalysis, forgets the unconscious, retreats or regresses to behaviorism. That is when we can think about theory both as weaponized on the one side, and then on the other hand, that's something else that psychoanalysis always reminds us is happening, that we are called to have sort of even hovering attention to all the potential things that might be happening, except in those spaces when suddenly it becomes concrete and only one potential option is there. That's where our problem starts to come. When the only legible issue is one that reinscribes the structural violence, right, that initially was there to begin with. And if we don't find those spaces of movement, that's when I start saying, like, psychoanalysis is telling on itself. Supervisors are telling on themselves when there isn't movement. When I want to platform Razan's voice just a little bit now, when a supervisor asks a Palestinian, how does your Palestinianness affect your countertransfer towards your Jewish patient, but doesn't ask the same of a Jewish supervisee. For a practice that is obsessed with universalism, it's really interesting when universalism collapses, right? And when it becomes imbricated in an individual that always occupies the position of the other. And this is a thing we see over and over and over again. I could be speaking about the Black experience in the context of the United States. I could be speaking about indigenous folks in the United States, but we're not today. We're talking about Palestinians, right? And that's the piece here. And that's what sort of comes forward is, when does psychoanalytic theory fail us and why? Not because clinicians don't know psychoanalytic theory. They schooled not only their Israeli supervisors, but us in psychoanalytic theory.
Andrew.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about what's wrong with psychoanalysis, but I think I'll just say two comments briefly. The first is that you're presenting a unique insight into the fig leaf manipulation by Israel of do-gooding activities on the part of some of its citizens, especially professionals, and specifically for this audience, mental health professionals, psychotherapists, and psychoanalysts. It is a con, actually. I mean, I'm not saying that nothing is imparted. What I am saying, and this comes from talking to a few people who have participated in being supervised by Jungian analysts and by sandplay therapists, the approved affective position is gratitude and deference. Now, it's not easy to challenge your supervisors in Western psychoanalytic institutes. It's bloody well impossible in the kind of context you're talking about, but it permits the Israeli propaganda apparatus to say, we are good, really. Look what we're doing. And the second, even briefer comment is that this is typical of colonial activity, civilizing the natives, bringing good, bringing clean water, bringing medicine, bringing social organizations, as if these things were completely absent before. And that's the last comment I want to make. And I'm thinking of Heba here, whose work on this is important. Yes, you can indigenize psychoanalysis, although at my late stage of development, I'm wondering what the fuck for? Why bother? But there is also the question of indigenous approaches to healing and the use of indigenous cultural narratives, historical experience, group solidarity, and things like this, which, as far as I'm aware, are simply not only not imparted when an Israeli professional supervises a deferential and gratitudinous Palestinian student, but cannot be imparted. And this is a terrible, terrible situation, that we have a whole group culture that could be understood, could be used, could be learned from, actually. Israelis could learn a few things instead of learning always from Europe and America. That is completely being overlooked. And this is also the acme, the heart of colonialism.
We are almost over. Sorry about this. Lara, Stephen, how do you feel?
Usually with my hands.
I just want to respond as we sort of, you're such a dork. This is where I want to sort of respond as a way of refocusing again, that these are logics of a system. I think that's what Andrew's sort of getting at, right? A logics of a system. And I want to say that indigenous people have been telling us this for ages. Palestinians have been telling us this for ages, which is why it's so important for us to say that this book didn't invent this, right? That people like Heba, like Yuad, like Wadad, like Ali, like Najla, like all the people that were so generous, they've been doing this for ages. And that is a really important piece to say this. But to go back to your point, Andrew, about the logics, is that there's a psychotic process that's involved in that logic. Because it's not just about the magnanimity of giving water. It's about stealing the water and then giving it back and expecting thank you because I filled up your empty belly that was otherwise completely dry without me. That's a psychotic process, right? And I would call on us as clinicians to take up this seriously and say, what is the harm and the structural violence that we are perpetuating in perpetuating that logic? And in not allowing Palestinians to say, no, this water was stolen. You're not just trying to sell it to me. It was stolen. They're the folks who have the most direct link to reality, material reality and reality principles, something that psychoanalysis seems to have forgotten entirely.
I thank you, Andrew. I just want to.
Oh, I think that.
Okay. I just want to come back and recenter again. I think following Lara, the activism and the practice of all the incredible Palestinian clinicians that we came upon, and they were so generous to us, and we are so humbled to continue to collaborate with them. And you were talking, Andrew, and I completely hear what you're saying. I will want to just only point to that there's not necessarily a binary between indigenous practices and psychoanalysis. And that kind of goes back to Heba's initial question, right? I mean, modernity is Arab modernity too, man. I mean, we've been fucking doing shit for a long time, right? But it's always this over here, or Arab modernity, or Arab this and Arab that and that. No, man, I mean, we've been fucking going to goddamn Oxford, and Oxford has been coming to us for tons of years, right? So when you look at practice, we end up talking about, as Lara mentioned, this sort of network of a set number of clinics that we focus on. And what strikes me about them is that they are incredibly aware of the social and collective mission in which they have. Allahu Akbar. So here, and I think this also to some degree answers Nora's question too, is like, here we have very well trained, very smart clinicians, whether they're like Mustafa Qasuqsi, who's trained in Britain and Italia, or Yaad, or and Ali. They're also thinking about ways in which they contribute to their community, to their people, to how they're connected, how they bring that into the clinical setting, and how they can connect with, and they know that what they are going to experience is also going to go back, and it goes back into their professional networks. So I just kind of want to mess it up a little bit, and that sort of dichotomy between that, and just, and for me, the point of messing that up is also just to say, like, wow, what these people are doing is, if it weren't for settler colonialism, inspiring. Thank you. It would be inspiring no matter where. That is happening under the most vociferous, brutal settler colonial condition in the world at this moment is even more inspiring.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There are two additional comments, and before we reach, let's say, our concluding ritual. Martin, do you want to share what you wrote in the chat?
I don't think I need too much to expand upon it. I think the the presumptions of the neutrality of our professions in the West has been kind of undermined for many more people by, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the acceptance that our own colonialism and supremacist assumptions are integral to the way our professions operate and so on. And I think that the way in which Stephen and Lara have unpacked this under this idea of the psychoanalytic innocence and so forth, just undermines the whole sort of ideology of psychoanalysis as a neutral discipline outside of society and so forth, which I think are the grounds on which those of us who argue that our institutions should take a position on colonialism in this particular context are rebuked or are rejected. And I just think there's a very useful and helpful contribution on that sort of political level. Thank you. That's all.
Lara, Stephen, do you want to add something on this?
Thank you, Martin, for all the work that you do, Martin. I appreciate that.
Eba, you wanted to share something more.
I did have a question, but I think we heard the answer and different comments, so it's fine. I also would like to thank Andrew for what you said. It's true that the work I tried to do is to give back the soul of Palestine to the Palestinians, not that it has ever left them, but actually that it's there, alive and living. And the situation is sick, not the people. Mm-hmm. So what I tried to do in my work is to bring back the traditions, all the Palestinian traditions that have been annihilated by the Israeli plan to annihilate Palestine, and study them psychologically, and found ways to give them back to Palestine. And that's the work I do, bringing back what is ours back to us. And that's wholesome healing. We don't need more than that. I have a song to conclude for this evening, and I will send the lyrics in the chat box.
Before you play the song, Tine, please stop the recording. This is unfortunately for copyright purposes, because we